Dear learners, I welcome you all. Today we will together try to learn about the concept of self and identity in Indian thought. After the completion of this module, you should be able to learn about the notion of self and identity in Indian philosophical systems. You should be able to understand the concept of self as defined in Upanishad and Vedanta. We will also explore the concept of self as defined in Jainism, Buddhism. We will discuss the concept of self as visualized in Indian epics. Also, we shall be able to compare the concept of self from Western and Indian philosophical perspectives. So, let us start our journey by exploring the concept of self and identity in Indian philosophical systems. India preserves a rich and diverse philosophical tradition, and the Indian philosophy is one of the primitives in the world and differs from Western philosophical thoughts with respect to its internality. Vedas and Upanishads are considered as the major source of Indian philosophy, although Western philosophy focuses mostly on external phenomena, while as the Indian philosophy emphasizes on inner thoughts. Indian philosophy encompasses a wide range of systems and schools that explores truth. It is characterized by an introspective approach towards reality, pertaining itself to knowledge of the inner self of man or Atma Vidya. The orthodox, we can say astic or theist, and the heterodox, Gnostic or atheist schools of Indian philosophy, namely Nyaya, Vasishtha, Sankhya, Yoga, Mimamsa, Vedanta, Charvaka, Jain, Buddha represents the intellectual exploration of truth in Indian philosophy. The Sanskrit word Atma, meaning inner self, portrays it as the essence of Manushya, individual, human being, or the Pudgala, psychophysical complex or matter that comprises the mind, body, and sense organs. Associated terms like Atma, Purush, Jeev, Jivatma represents the spiritual side of self and identity, while as Aham, Ahankar, Ahambhav, Abhiman, and Asmita represents the psychological side of self and identity in Indian philosophy. Since the beginning of idea of Aham, I, or self has been a topic of interest to Indian philosophers. Indian philosophy is an effort to comprehend the nature of the everyday practice of an individual and ultimately help in enhancing their living experiences. Now, let us try to understand the detailed meaning of self and identity in Indian philosophy. The term self and identity are closely interrelated but are used in diverse manner in Indian philosophy. In general, the term identity refers to how an individual is perceived by others, while self refers to who I am and what I am. In traditional philosophy, Atma, Purush, Jeev, and Jivatma represents the spiritual side of self and identity, while Aham, Ahankar, Ahambhav, Abhiman, and Asimita describes the psychological side of self and identity. So let us begin with Atma. The term Atma represents the inner self and has been frequently used in Atharva Ved. However, the use of the term Atma has been undergone various modifications from the Vedas to Upanishads. Vedic philosophers Sayana originated the term Atma from the breathing process, while Vupadev signifies movement or action. Thus, Atma depicts the dynamic principle of breathing, movement, and actions. Summarizing these, Atma fills the body, receives the impressions from the outer world, and enjoys or experiences the presentational objects. In classical Indian philosophy, the lower self is imprisoned by the law of karma, steering rebirth and death, while the higher self is free. Now, Purush. In Indian philosophy, especially the Sankhya system and term Purush, we can say it as cosmic life, depicts an eternal and authentic spirit. Purush epitomizes the principle of consciousness along with Prakriti, which represents the principle of materiality created by Triguna, namely Sattva, Rajas, and Tams. Now we are going to talk about Jeev. Jeev. In Jainism, Jeev are opposite to Ajeev. Jeev is understood as soul and is departed with death. In Mukta Jeev, the pure state rise to the top of the universe where they reside with other perfected beings and are never again reborn. Jeev is bounded by samsara, the wheel of birth and death, transmigration, as they are enclosed with karma. These reside on Jeev, narrating both actions and emotions. Jain thinkers hold the view that Jeev is entrapped in a Jeev. Jeev is measured as the life force in the individual, which later comes to the empirical self of phenomenal experience. Jivatma. The Jivatma in Indian philosophical systems refers to the individual soul or self. Yoga unites Jivatma with the Atma, that is, the personal self to the cosmic self. Moksha. It can be said that liberation from the cycle of death and rebirth. Bhakti, obtaining pure divine love. And Jivan Mukt, self-knowledge that provides liberation while living, are the three ultimate goals of the Jiva. Yoga, though intensifying mindfulness and generating a deeper wisdom of concord, can help in achieving these goals. Aham, ego, ahankar, I-ness, or egoism, concept of individuality, oneness, literally the one maker, ahambhav, abhiman, and asimta. Ahankar or egoism is the self-arrogating principle of man. It is a modification that arises in the mind. Patanjali Maharishi calls this by the name asmita. The same mind assumes the form of egoism when man self-arrogates himself. Moving forward, let us see how the notion of self and identity is defined in Upanishad. The self is the core component of Upanishadic philosophy. The true self, Atma or Purusha, comprises the ceaseless light of consciousness and has no birth or death, no pleasure, no pain, no past, no future. The true self does not modify itself. Along the fluxes of mind, the quest for truth in this philosophy is completely inwards and centers around the idea that God is the innermost spirit within man. Upanishad considers that the Atma, which resides within man, is the same that lights the sun. Upanishads believe that the Atma is the source of internal and external light, and God remains the inner spirit within man. The Upanishad clarifies that the self is the conscious, eternal, and transcendental being. Spiritualism in Upanishad is the root of Indian philosophy and consists of four pillars that are self, rebirth, karma, and liberation. Probing deep within the self, an individual can achieve supreme reality is the notion of Upanishadic teaching. The Upanishads also distinct man's empirical self from his true self or Atma. It deems that the empirical self is the existential self, subject to sorrow and suffering and subject to change, while the true self is the unchanging Atma that observes the empirical phenomena but is unaffected and undying. Moreover, the difference between Ahankar, that is ego, and Atma in the Upanishad is of great connotation. A man's realization of his true self in Upanishads refers to an individual's ability to regulate the ego. In the primordial days, the aim of education in India was self-realization through self-knowledge, which was well shaped by the Upanishadic tradition. Now, we will try to understand the notion of self in Vedanta. Vedanta teaches that a deeper version of self can take one to true happiness. It says that the self is the entire universe and is not limited to body. It claims that the inner self is full of light and one's role in the universe is to bring light, compassion and wisdom to all. Advaita Vedanta contemplates Atma as self-existent, awareness, limitless and non-dual. It also claims that there is one spirit or soul, or we can say self, that links all beings regardless of their shape and size, and there is no distinction, no superior, no inferior, no separate devout soul, Atma, no separate God, soul, Brahma. The notion of Atma and Jivatma under the principle of Advaita Vedanta, non-dualism, we can say, considers that both Atma and Brahma as the same. The consciousness remains the essential element of Atma and not by chance. According to Shankara, the pure conscious Atma comes in contact with the mind, sense body, and intellect, and consequently is committed to the bond of karma, and due to this karma, Atma becomes Jivatma to Maya. From a transcendental opinion, the Jivatma is untrue or unreal, while it is true or real from a practical opinion. After getting moksha, the karma bonded with Atma and Jivatma become entirely free from Maya and gets its own consciousness. Moving forward, we will now try to explore the concept of self in Jainism. Jiv and Ajiv is distinct for Jain metaphysics. By the bond of karma, man, Jiv, is destined to Ajiv. To escape this bond, man must purify himself by rejecting the actions. According to Jain, Atma is a conscious substance and is always active, although Jiv derives connections with mind, sense, body, and intellect, and further it attaches with Pudgala. Consequently, it turns out to be Buddha-Jiv, which is the individual self enclosed with karma bondage or Pudgala. However, Buddha-Jiv can be made free from all types of karma by following certain paths prearranged by Jainism. All this may have in transferring Jiv into its own real form. In accordance with Jain's philosophy, the self can be achieved by having entire knowledge about the self, which poses various doubts and questions. Jiv or self experiences, perceptions, and intuition. This philosophy claims that Jiv or self is a dynamic entity and it exists. Jainism instructs self-control that helps in developing a mature person. Now, let us see the notion of self in Buddhism. The Buddhist notion of man is much more complex. Nirvana, we can say extinction, perfection, the great peace, blowing out, is regarded as the supreme principle of Buddhist philosophy. Nirvana is a state of complete liberation. Buddhists have evolved an extremely intricate idea of the nature of man and focuses on relieving man from miseries. The doctrine of relative pluralism, Anikant is the key differences between Jainism and Buddhism. Buddha says that the self is not eternal and is made up of Panchkand, Roop, matter, Nam, subtle matter, Sambidhan, sensual experience, Sakhar, mental state, and Vigyan, consciousness, which keeps on changing and is not permanent. This means that there is no permanent self and everything in this world is changeable and temporary, and so is self. Buddhism aims to overpower the pain and disturbances instigated by the challenges and difficulties in life. In accordance with this philosophy, the eternal goal of an individual is to achieve nirvana, a state of non-self that involves a process of renouncing worldly things, especially those which create ambitions, temptations, and proud in us. Liberation is not attained by knowledge of such a self, but by turning away from what might erroneously be regarded as the self. The Buddha's teachings are aimed at attaining authentic and durable happiness by cultivating a transition from self state to the non-self state. Now we will try to understand the notion of self in epics. A more realistic inspection of man in action is witnessed in Ramayana and Mahabharata. Compared to Vedas and Upanishads, Bhagavad Gita makes a balance between the theistic and the atheistic notion of Atma. The second chapter of Bhagavad Gita discusses the detailed concept of Atma and Jivatma, are the two ideas pertaining to Atma in Bhagavad Gita. The Jivatma is an eternal Akshar Purush that enjoys Triguna, namely Sattva, Rajas and Tams. This led to rebirth by the individual self. Moreover, the Jivatma, that we can say individual self, after attaining moksha can reconstruct in its own original form. Shuddhatma, supreme self. The three paths of moksha described in Bhagavad Gita are Karma Yoga, path of action, Bhakti Yoga, path of devotion, and Jnana Yoga, path of knowledge. After attaining moksha, the Atma enjoys eternal peace, bliss, and becomes God. Bhagavad Gita imparts several teachings on knowledge of the self and the world. It is assumed that generally a man's knowledge about self is dependent upon one's ability to associate, infer, and integrate information gained through observations and experiences. Knowledge about self begins with observations, examinations, and evaluation of the self through developing divine qualities. Now, at last, we are going to compare between Western and Indian perspective of self. The concept of Atma, self, in Indian philosophy is similar to psyche, soul, in the Greek tradition. The Atmajan in Indian thoughts is parallel to know thyself. In Greek tradition, the focus on self distinguishes the Indian philosophy from the Western philosophies. Greek philosophers like Socrates and Plato were generally outward looking, while the Indian philosophers observed more inwards. The essence of man in Greek philosophy has been the reason, while the essence of man in Indian philosophy was beyond reason. It is the Atma. Western philosophy has a strong concern for the society, while Indian philosophy focuses on man relation to God. The ethical relation between God and man in Indian philosophy is translated and transmitted into that of delightful relationship. Western philosophy has often criticized the Indian counterparts on the grounds that it shows individual by highlighting the universe, Atma. Moreover, Indian philosophy of man is based on negativism and inaction. Karma Yoga, path of action, Bhakti Yoga, path of devotion, and Jnana Yoga, path of knowledge, has always attracted Indian philosophers. Karma Yoga and Jnana Yoga are aided to devotion, Bhakti Yoga. At last, we can summarize all this. We can conclude that the Indian philosophy is rich and vibrant in its approach. The Astic school of Indian philosophy claims that the self or Atma is a substantial but non-material unit, while the Gnostic schools of Indian philosophy like Buddhists interrogates this argument. The source of philosophical interpretations about the self in Indian tradition is inclined by the Upanishad, while the self is depicted as the underlying foundation of cognitive abilities, but characterized in a negative light because it itself is not an object that can be cognitively grasped. In the end, we can say that direct or indirect, all the schools of Indian philosophy has considered the existence of Atma, self. There is no doubt that Indian philosophical texts are richer and deeper in descriptions of self, and their essence encompasses all the levels of consciousness known to human beings. With this, we conclude this module, and I thank you all.